many Republican ideas. Some of them have already been incorporated across state lines in the Senate bill, for instance, under a compromise. Certainly I think that's true. But he also made it clear to Senator Mitch McConnell that it can't simply be the couple Republican ideas that there are, and that's the whole bill, and you don't incorporate any Democratic ideas either. It's got to be a true compromise. You got to meet us halfway. And I do think the Democrats certainly, as Aaron says, we're the majority parties right now. The Democrats are going to need to and want to work with Republicans if they will meet us halfway. But if they won't, then there's really nothing you can do. You can't. It's not a compromise to say, well, don't do it your way, but do it exactly our way, and don't address these other important issues that Democrats have brought up.
Congressman Schock, we have this tweet from Craig. Has Congressman Schock received any stimulus money for his district, and would he be willing to return the money since it has not worked in other states?
Well, first of all, let's back up and address what the stimulus was supposed to do. When the president talked about the stimulus bill, it was a $787 billion bill that, if passed, would stop unemployment from going past 8%. It's been a year since the stimulus bill has been passed. Unemployment is at or near double digits in my state, and I think most states in the union. And so arguably it hasn't worked for its purported goal, which was to stop unemployment from increasing and specifically past 8%. Now, the tweeter is suggesting that because I did not support the stimulus bill and because the stimulus bill arguably hasn't worked to create jobs, that the 18th congressional district in the center part of Illinois should not get its fair share of federal spending. This is the same kind of argument that people make that members should not get federal spending for their districts if they vote against out-of-control federal spending. The reality is we need to have a serious debate on both sides in a bipartisan fashion about responsible federal spending. Even the president said we need to get our financial house in order, and I hope he's serious about that because I know he's going to get a lot of support from Republicans on that issue. But at the end of the day, when the federal budget is set, regardless of how members vote on the federal spending, it is then their next responsibility to advocate for the economic interests of their district. And that means whether it's highway projects or education funding, you name it, each one of our representatives has a responsibility to advocate for their district to get their fair share of funding. And the stimulus funds are no different from that. A large part of that money went to the states. My state of Illinois, the 5th largest in the country, got a big chunk of that. And it's been handed out by our governor at his discretion more so than really representatives. So there's been very little money for members of Congress to go in and fight for. There were no earmarks as a part of the stimulus bill. I'm not sure that it was necessarily spent that much more judiciously as a result. But certainly I'm not going to advocate for our taxpayers turning back stimulus money when they're going to be on the hook and their children's and future generations are going to be on the hook to pay that money back.
Harrison, Arkansas. Robert, Democrats line. You're on with Aaron Schock and Dan Maffei, both members of Congress.
Thank you. I was particularly amused at the comment earlier that government should not be involved in business. And I would remind the Congressman that China seems to be really growing its economy, and all of its business is controlled by government. And I would like to say that it's standards that's the problem. I've heard it, the global economy, that's true, but you also need global standards. And in this country, we have standards that are mandated. If you don't like the standard, you change it. But in the meantime, you don't bypass the standard and go to a country, particularly a communist country, produce that product, call that trade, and bring it back. So that government has a lot to do with business. And now it's a question of which government do you want to support. And as I see it, the free traders are truly supporting a communist system. And I just think the other way. Thank you.
Give you a chance, both of you, to answer that question.
Well, if I can, I want to thank the caller for his question. I couldn't agree with him more from the standpoint that we need to be promoting the production of goods in our country as opposed to the production of goods in other countries. But the idea that trade with countries like China or India or Russia or any of the other partners around the world means that the goods are manufactured there and not here is completely untrue. I represent one of the largest manufacturers in our country, Caterpillar. And as I mentioned earlier in your program, 70% of the tractors that Caterpillar builds are sent to other countries, and China is one of their largest customers. So to suggest that we don't want trade agreements with these countries is to really stick our head in the sand and not realize where the customer base is in this world. We only have 5% of the world's population in the world. We only have 5%. So it's a defeatist mentality, in my view, to suggest that we would be better off if we walled up our country and said, we don't want to trade, we're better off just selling and buying from those in our country. We have the latest, greatest technologies. I believe we have some of the best minds in the world. And it's to our companies and our employees, their employees' best interest to be able to sell and market and compete with the other 95% of the world's population. He mentioned the importance of these trade agreements, or rather that we sell in other countries. I want to tell you that the Colombia, the Panama, and the South Korea trade agreements that the President mentioned that are on the table right now for consideration would be a huge boon to the employees in my district. The large ag economy, which sell their grains and goods around the world, the large manufacturers in our district that sell their manufactured goods around the world. The country of Colombia alone, for example, 80% of their wheat in Colombia is provided to them by U.S. farmers. 80% of the wheat in the country of Colombia is provided by U.S. farmers. Colombia just signed this year a free trade agreement with the country of Canada. If we don't pass a free trade agreement with Colombia so that there aren't taxes on our wheat going into their country, they are going to begin buying their wheat from Canada. They've already said this. The President knows this. He's talked about it as well. And we're going to be put at a competitive disadvantage. Right now, we buy Colombia's flowers, we buy their coffee, all tariff-free. So it's to our advantage right now, as your caller mentioned, for us to eliminate those tariffs, to allow our goods and products to go there tariff-free, and to establish a free trade agreement. So I agree it needs to be free and fair trade. We don't want to be putting our companies at a competitive disadvantage from other countries or for other companies around the world. But we need these trade agreements, we need these expanded markets and these new customers for our industries here to grow and for them to employ more people.
Congressman Maffei?
Yeah, I do see this issue a little bit different than Aaron. I certainly agree that we need free and fair trade, but I think the problem is we have to have the right kinds of trade agreements, and all of the trade agreements that follow on this NAFTA model aren't working, not because it's trade, but because it's not on a level playing field. Essentially, it'd be like two teams coming onto a field, and they're asked to play by different rules. And that's a real problem. It's particularly a problem, as the caller mentions, with China. China, which won't even float its own currency, so it makes it difficult to trade, because when we have a trade, normally when you would have a trade deficit, your currency compared to the Chinese currency would change, and then it would become better for China to buy more goods here. But that's not happening. They don't protect intellectual property rights. They don't have the kind of labor or environmental protections, and they don't have the, and we don't always know what we're getting, and whether it's pet food or building supplies. We've already had issues with China and not getting what we think we're getting. So I do think that these things are important, and I do think we've been erring far too much on the side of, well, trade has got to be good, and we just, if we could just do enough trade, everybody will be happy. And it has put a lot of people in my district out of work, and in some ways needlessly so, because then these jobs do move abroad, and they move to China, and guess what? The products aren't as good there, and eventually they might move somewhere else. And but it has undermined our industrial base. We as a country have to manufacture things. We have to have a strong manufacturing base. I think Aaron is right that we have to have a strong agricultural base too, and I have a lot of agriculture in my district as well, and that depends on exports. But we have to also acknowledge that we can't be naive, and we can't just put up with other countries breaking these rules or bending the rules and having a different set of rules while we continue to do things, with the utmost quality that we can.
Next call for our two guests comes from Yorktown, Virginia. Mary, Independent Line.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
I have a question or a comment and a follow-up, a question and a short follow-up. how can we take y'all seriously about creating jobs and things like that if y'all are not going to crack down on those people that hire illegals? We have 15 or 14 million unemployed, but yet y'all continue to allow 7 million of our jobs to be worked by illegals. You know, what are y'all going to do about that? And then I have a follow-up question.
What is your follow-up, Mary?
My follow-up question is, you know, explain to people that have lost their jobs, that have ended up homeless because y'all failed to protect American workers by making employment verification mandatory for all jobs. We're tired of excuses. Let's
start with Congressman Maffei in Syracuse.
I think Mary is right. I think we do have to make employment verification necessary. I think we do have to crack down on employers who hire undocumented workers, because if you don't do that, then you're going to create an incentive for more and more undocumented workers to come in this country. But I do think you have to do it in a way that does make sure that we have, for instance, the farm workers that are needed to work on these the things that she says. There's a lot of Americans unemployed, and that's true, and we need to train them to do the kinds of jobs that are needed, like agriculture jobs and other kinds of high-skilled employment. But currently there aren't those folks, and there are a lot of farmers in my district who simply cannot find enough Americans to do these jobs, and so they do depend on seasonal, legal workers right now, but there's not enough of them. And so while we have to crack down on any employer who hires undocumented workers, we also have to make sure that there are programs that allow people to come in and do the jobs that Americans are not doing now. Meanwhile, we do have to do better work with training, and I think all of that can be done in immigration legislation, which hopefully will be dealt with this year.
Congressman Schock?
Well, Peter, the same verification system that's used in every federal agency in our federal government, E-Verify, ought to be required, and we ought to work to ensure that E-Verify is used in every private business so that when someone is hired, their verification as an American citizen, as an illegal worker, as a tax-paying member of society is verified as well. It's that simple. The caller is right. We have a broken immigration system. We need to fix it. There's a large, complex part of that. Obviously, we need better border security. We need to be able to control who's coming in and out of our country. We can't just talk about punishing employers who hire illegals. Obviously, we need a system that works so that they can verify that, in fact, whether that person is legal or not. But we also have to be able to stop them from coming in and out of our country. It's a matter of national security as well as employment security. We also need to reform the immigration process. Right now, it takes 8 years on the average for people to become an American citizen. I don't think my great-grandparents or other folks' relatives who came here that are second and third generation Americans would have waited on Ellis Island for 8 years to figure out whether or not they qualified to become an American. So we need a much more agile and 21st century immigration policy and immigration system that actually works. But to the caller's point, we need, I believe, to ensure that the same E-Verify system that the federal government mandates for itself is also used and required and enforced on private employers as well, to make sure that the people they're employing, the people they're paying wages, are in fact paying taxes and are legal residents or workers to be here.
Gentlemen, before we take this next call, earlier in the program we were talking with our viewers about whether or not the Obama administration is perceived as anti-business and whether that was a fair perception or not, given the president's interview with Bloomberg Newsweek that he did on February 9th. Congressman Schock, let's start with you and see if you think that's a fair perception, and then Congressman Maffei, you can answer.
Well, look, I think it's more than a perception. I think anyone would have to argue that it's reality. First of all, let's step back. Whose view really matters? I mean, go talk to the business guy. I mean, if you come back to your district, which I know Dan and I do nearly every weekend, and other members of Congress do, you walk into the small business guy, he'll tell you that the Obama administration, the federal government especially, has been anti-business this past year. When you talk about cap and trade and you talk about health care, and those are your major initiatives this year, both of those contain hundreds of taxes and fees on, yes, those business people, those small business people that are trying to struggle, that are trying to create jobs. 7 out of the 10 of new jobs created last year were done so by small businesses, and yet the 2 major pieces of legislation that President Obama has spent much of this year talking about, which are cap and trade, which is a huge energy tax, and health care, which is a huge tax paid for either on earnings or on payroll taxes. There were different versions both in the House and the Senate. It's anti-business. He's continued to talk about corporations as if they're evil organizations that are sucking the lifeblood out of local communities. The reality is we need employers in this country because they are, in fact, the ones who create jobs that employ people, and we need to be talking about much more pro-growth strategies, whether it's trade, as the President mentioned in his State of the Union, whether it's helping lending so that there's freed up capital for these entrepreneurs to go out and invest, or whether it's pro-growth tax policies like incentivizing risk-taking and investment and entrepreneurialism through R&D tax credit. We could make the R&D tax credit permanent. That's a bill that I'm working on with the Democrat member of my Small Business Committee, Glenn Nye.